Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Montreal Mobstars. Today we're looking into the life and death of Sidney Leithman, Montreal's notorious mob lawyer, shot and killed while driving to work on May 13, 1991. Due to his extensive criminal client list and other factors that we'll get into later in this video, the murder remains unsolved to this day. Before we begin, we would like to extend our deepest condolences to the Leithman family who lost their husband, father, and family member on that day. Sidney Leithman, known to his friends as Sid, was one of Montreal's top criminal defense lawyers during the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. He had clients that included gang leaders like Frank Cotroni of the Cotroni Crime Family, Frank Dunie Ryan and Alan the Weasel Ross of the West End Gang, the Dubois Brothers, and even members of the Medellin and Cali Cartels. While driving to work on May 13, 1991, he was gunned down and murdered in his car during what was described by police as a professional hit. While countless theories exist speculating who had Leithman killed and why, the case remains unsolved to this day. He clearly angered at least one of his clients, but who exactly had the lawyer killed? For the sake of clarity, we'll present this video with details of his major cases involving his principal clients, each of whom may be viable suspects in his murder, each presented in a separate chapter. We'll begin with the Dubois Brothers, move on to the Cotroni Crime Family, then discuss the West End Gang, and conclude with the Colombian Cartels. As an added bonus, we'll shine the spotlight on another organization whose members may have benefited seeing Leithman permanently silenced. That organization was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP for short. It's reported that Leithman also represented members of the Rizzuto crime family and Hells Angels. However, those clients weren't his principal clients, nor his main source of income. Although they could be considered suspects in his death, we'll focus on the organizations that frequently used Leithman's services. Sidney Leithman was born in Montreal in 1936 and grew up poor to working-class parents Jack and Ethel. Young Sidney knew he wasn't fit for a life of poverty and watched as Jack struggled to provide for the family, working hard as a tailor. Young Sidney needed to concoct an escape plan to avoid a life of poverty, and he chose law as his way to go from rags to riches. While preparing for university at Montreal's Baron Byng High School, he excelled in school with the goal of becoming a lawyer already established by the time he graduated. He worked hard to put himself through law school at McGill University, where he graduated in 1960. Sidney Leithman became a member of the Quebec Bar Association, and he started to practice law as a criminal defense lawyer in Montreal, initially defending prostitutes' clients. His aggressive personality, with a developed sense of persuasion, made him a legend at arguing on behalf of his clients, and his practice began to flourish. As he gained notoriety, Leithman earned the reputation within Montreal's criminal underworld as the go-to lawyer. After organized crime leaders noticed that he was able to get his clients a not guilty verdict or greatly reduce the sentence if they received a guilty verdict. It got to the point where those getting arrested would often shout, "Get me Leithman," to any nearby associates watching the arrest go down. If a criminal wanted Sidney Leithman to represent them, however, they had to have a healthy bankroll for Leithman to take their call. As a self-confessed workaholic, Sidney Leithman put his all into defending his clients, and he was known to arrive at the office early in the morning to work on cases. Those familiar with Leithman's professional character described him as a wheeler-dealer within the city's political circles. The Dubois Brothers, or the Dubois Gang, were a French-Canadian organized crime group that operated in Montreal from the 1950s through the 1980s. The Dubois family grew up in Saint-Henri, a working-class district of Montreal. Of the 10 brothers in the family, 9 of them were part of the infamous gang that ran extortion and protection rackets, drug dealing, loan sharking, exploitation of strippers and prostitutes, and murder. At one point, the Quebec Crime Commission said of the gang, "Some maintain that the ruthless methods of the Dubois, the large number of toughs gravitating about each of the 9 brothers, as well as the widely dreaded cruelty of their hirelings, makes them the most influential crime group at the present time on the island of Montreal." The Dubois brothers took that as a compliment. Leithman was first reported working for the Dubois brothers in 1968, when he represented Claude Dubois, who was arrested and charged with being partly responsible for a murder. Leithman called 17 witnesses to speak on behalf of Dubois and the other two accused, and the accused were eventually set free after Leithman and the other lawyers argued their client's innocence. In 1976, again representing Claude Dubois, Leithman held a press conference with fellow lawyer Roland Blaise. At the press conference, the Dubois brothers stripped naked in front of the attending members of the local press to show the wounds they received from police beatings. Later that year, Leithman represented Jean-Guy Dubois, who was accused of murder. Although Leithman said of the Dubois brothers, "The Dubois name constitutes an obstacle that's difficult to overcome." The trial ended with a guilty verdict, but Leithman demanded of the court that each juror announce their respective vote in determining the accused's guilt or innocence. Each juror said guilty when it was their turn, until it was juror number 9's turn. Juror number 9, whose only reported personal attribute was that he was a man, said guilty, innocent, I don't know. The case was eventually thrown out, and Jean-Guy Dubois was a free man. The Dubois brothers held on to their powerful grip on Montreal until about the mid-80s, when the gang collapsed from within, after more than half the brothers were found guilty on various charges that included murder. In 1971, Leithman was hired by Frank Cotroni, Montreal's crime figure of the criminal organization with ties to New York's Bonanno crime family. Cotroni, while in Acapulco, Mexico, arranging a heroin deal, was charged with being in possession of stolen jewelry. Although it turned out to be a case of mistaken identity and the Mexican police didn't file any charges, Cotroni could afford the best possible lawyer to represent him, and he chose Sidney Leithman. Frank Cotroni wasn't like other typical mafia guys, a group infamously known to work from the shadows and prefer anonymity while avoiding the spotlight. Cotroni liked the media attention his position brought him, and with Sidney Leithman's guidance, the two organized a press conference held the month following his arrest. Canada wasn't, and still isn't, known for mafia holding press conferences, and the event must have raised some eyebrows within Canada's law enforcement community. In front of the attending members of the Canadian press, who were served appetizers and generously poured drinks mixed by Sidney Leithman himself, Frank Cotroni professed his innocence and maintained that the charges were simply a case of mistaken identity. In 1971, Leithman represented Joe DiMallo, who was accused of being partly responsible for a triple homicide in Casa Loma, a bar on St. Catherine Street East. DiMallo was a member of the Cotroni Crime Family, and when the trial began, he was represented by Sidney Leithman. Although the judge found DiMallo and his accomplices guilty, the verdict was overturned by the Supreme Court of Canada, and the accused were set free. In November 1974, Leithman again represented Frank Cotroni when the mafioso was arrested in Canada following an extradition request to the United States, where he would face charges of smuggling $3 million worth of heroin into the country. As a suspected member of the French Connection, which was responsible for flooding New York with heroin after it was shipped from Marseille, France, to the Big Apple via Montreal, Frank Cotroni was wanted in the United States. Although the crimes Cotroni allegedly committed were on Canadian soil, the extradition was granted, and Cotroni was sentenced to 15 years in a U.S. prison and fined $20,000. Cotroni served only 4 years before being paroled with a promise to never return to the United States. When Cotroni returned to Montreal in April 1979, Sidney Leithman spoke to media present at the airport on behalf of Cotroni, simply telling the media, "I don't know what his plans are." Sidney Leithman continued to represent members of the Cotroni crime family until his death in 1991. Throughout the 70s and early 80s, one of Leithman's most frequent clients was Frank Dunie Ryan, leader of Montreal's Irish-Canadian West End gang. Known at the time as the King of Coke for his booming cocaine importing business as one of North America's largest importers, Dunie Ryan was so pleased with Leithman's criminal defense representation that he gave his lawyer a solid gold Irish ring, which Leithman wore with pride. While it's not known if Ryan also gifted Leithman with some cocaine, at some point his lawyer seemed to have acquired a taste for the finest uncut Colombian marching powder. Leithman's client, with arguably more access to the illegal drug than anyone else in the city, was also the client most likely to have introduced Leithman to cocaine. Leithman was on the fast track to becoming a millionaire, and he was living the high life. He was always stylishly dressed, he smoked the finest cigars, and he was known to carry around a fat wad of cash that he would whip out with willful abandon, and arguably unnecessary effort to impress those around him. As a criminal defense lawyer, Leithman made professional connections within Montreal police, including Detective Sergeant Andre Savard of the Armed Robbery Division. Following the Brinks heist of 1976, Savard was assigned to investigate the infamous robbery, which Montreal Mobstars has already covered in a previous video. Look for that link in the description. In 1976, while investigating the Brinks heist, Montreal police shot and killed John Slavy of the West End gang. Leithman heard from one of his clients, possibly Dunie Ryan himself, that a $50,000 murder-for-hire contract for the death of Andre Savard was on the streets. Because Dunie Ryan thought that Slavy had been murdered by police, specifically Andre Savard, who was on scene during the shooting. Leithman reached out to Detective Sergeant Savard to warn him of the contract, and Savard went into police protection. Savard denies that Slavy was executed by police, as he stated that his intent was to have Slavy become a witness for Crown prosecutors. Savard said that Slavy's direct involvement with the West End gang would have made him a valuable witness. In the end, nothing became of the hit, and Andre Savard safely emerged from behind the veil of police protection. On the night of November 14, 1984, Alan Ross, who was at the time second in command of the West End gang, noticed a heavy police presence at Nitolo's Garden restaurant on Upper Lachine. Fearing that his boss may have been arrested, Ross called Leithman to find out from Montreal police whether Dunie Ryan and Paul April, one of the gang's leader's associates, had been arrested that evening. But Dunie Ryan wasn't arrested. He was lured into a room of the motel adjacent to the restaurant, tied to a chair and shot to death. Following Dunie Ryan's death, Alan the Weasel Ross took over the West End gang's leadership role after it suddenly became vacant. He received that gangland nickname due to his rodent-like appearance and his ability to weasel out of police charges. Thanks to Leithman's call to police on the night of Dunie Ryan's death, investigators knew that Dunie Ryan was with Paul April on that fateful evening, and April was investigated as one of Dunie Ryan's killers. Unfortunately for police investigating the death of Dunie Ryan, they weren't able to bring Paul April to justice because he was killed less than 2 weeks later when a bomb detonated in an apartment where he was staying with another accomplice in the assassination of Dunie Ryan and 2 other criminals unrelated to Ryan's death. Alan Ross had hired Yves Apache Trudeau, a hitman for the Hells Angels, to avenge Ryan's death, and Apache Trudeau delivered a TV and VCR to the apartment where Dunie Ryan's suspected killers were hiding out. Apache Trudeau concealed 15 kilograms of C4 explosives in the TV, which he detonated using a remote detonator, causing significant damage to the building. All occupants of the targeted apartment unit and some tenants of the surrounding units were killed in the blast. He later said at trial, "I showed them the power of the Hells Angels." The remaining surviving suspected killer of Dunie Ryan was Edward Phillips, who was murdered in March 1985 by West End gang member David Singer. Following the death of Phillips, Singer went to Florida to hide out from Montreal police. In May 1985, Alan Ross was in Florida with other members of the West End gang, negotiating a shipment of cocaine from Florida to Quebec. Of those in Florida with Alan Ross were his wife, Sidney Leithman, Alain Strong, and Raymond Defosse. Ross had doubts that David Singer, who was still hiding out in Florida following the murder of Phillips, would be able to withstand police interrogation, should he be caught by law enforcement. Ross knew that Singer knew too much about Ross's involvement in the bombing, Ross's cocaine importation and distribution enterprise, and other information valuable to police, so Ross let Strong and Defosse know that Singer had to go. On May 9th, David Singer was shot and killed by Strong and Defosse. While driving back to their hotel, Strong and Defosse were pulled over by Florida State Trooper Michael Foti, who was shot in the leg by Defosse. The two fled the scene of the shooting on foot, and police found the gun used to kill Singer in the car they were driving. Singer's body was discovered the following day near Tiger Tail Lake in Dania, Florida. Inside his pants pockets were a piece of paper with Alan Ross's wife's phone number written on it. The death of David Singer would catch up to Alan Ross, as he would see the inside of a U.S. prison due to his involvement in the murder. He was arrested by U.S. Marshals at the Fort Lauderdale airport as he arrived in November 1991 after John Cotroni, a Florida-based police officer who turned in his badge to become an illicit drug importer. Cotroni admitted his involvement in Singer's murder. Following Cotroni's arrest in Texas for marijuana importation, he admitted to supplying Strong and DeFausse with a loaded pistol prior to Singer's murder. And he also admitted to driving the two Canadians to the airport so they could hastily return to Canada following the shooting of Trooper Foti. In May 1992, Ross was convicted of drug importation and sentenced to life behind bars without the possibility for parole, plus a $10 million fine. Later the same year, he was convicted of another set of drug importation charges along with the death of Singer and sentenced to an additional 30 years atop his life sentence. In 1983, Leithman was hired by Jairo El Mocho Garcia, a member of the Cali Cartel, who was stationed in Montreal to oversee the cartel's lucrative cocaine business. Leithman's retainer was a reported $500,000 a year. When Garcia was arrested in October 1983, he was charged with importing 16 kilograms of cocaine into Canada. Leithman represented Garcia, who won the acquittal for his client. Garcia returned to Colombia as a free man, and Leithman was reported to be a frequent traveler to Colombia during the 1980s, presumably as a valued guest of the Cali Cartel. Following the acquittal of Jairo Garcia, Leithman was hired by another member of the Cali Cartel, Inés Cecilia Barbosa, their Montreal-based money launderer. During 1989 and 1992, it was reported that she laundered more than $75 million from Montreal to Colombia through Montreal banks. However, the client-solicitor relationship was less than amicable than with Leithman and Jairo Garcia. In the days leading up to Leithman's death, witnesses saw Inés Barbosa slap Leithman across the face in a restaurant in Center Rockland, an upscale shopping mall in Montreal. While the exact details of the slap remains unknown, Barbosa was clearly upset with Leithman. In 1990, Leithman was hired to represent 23-year-old Richard Delgado Marquez from Bronx, New York, who was arrested in Canada for his part in importing 500 kilograms of cocaine into Canada by landing planes in New Brunswick between 1988 and April 1989. Eastern Canada at that time, specifically the Maritime provinces, was targeted by Colombian cartels as an ideal landing spot for their cocaine due to the remoteness of the region, its countless bays and inlets with direct access to the ocean, and a lack of electronic surveillance protecting its skies, making Eastern Canada relatively unprotected at the time from the invasion of planes arriving from South America loaded with cocaine. At the time of his arrest by RCMP agents, Delgado Marquez was babysitting 450 kilograms of cocaine inside a house on Montreal's Delisle Street, along with two other men, both of whom were from Medellin, Colombia. The principal witness for the Crown was Douglas Jaworski, a paid RCMP informant who was also a pilot for the Medellin cartel. Despite Sidney Leithman's representation, Delgado Marquez was sentenced to 25 years in prison. 1990 was a busy year as Leithman was hired to represent a Cuban-American pilot arrested in Canada, charged with importing the same cocaine as Leithman's former client, Richard Delgado Marquez. The pilot, Diego Jose Ganuza, pleaded not guilty, and the trial began in 1990. At 6:48 a.m. on Monday, May 13, 1991, Leithman, who was then a multimillionaire, was driving his black Saab convertible to work to prepare for an upcoming trial with Cali Cartel member Jairo Garcia, when a Jeep suddenly pulled out from a parking spot, forcing Leithman to abruptly come to a stop at the corner of Rockland and Monmouth Avenues. A gunman, who was waiting in a nearby phone booth, exited the phone booth and pointed a .45 caliber handgun towards Leithman's head and fired. The first bullet smashed Leithman's passenger side window. 4 additional shots were fired, each a kill shot to the lawyer's head. In a matter of seconds, the well-planned out and clearly professional hit was over, ending the life of Sidney Leithman. As he left, the killer threw a package of ham onto the body, possibly an anti-Semitic insult. During the course of the autopsy, cocaine was found in Leithman's blood, and it was reported that some of the drug was found either on or in Leithman's briefcase. Those responsible for Sidney Leithman's death have never been identified. The murder remains a cold case to this day, more than 30 years later. Jeff Borrow, a criminal defense lawyer whose office was above Leithman, said, "In the kinds of cases where people play hardball, you're going to think twice. Sid had a lot of cases where he was defending people the Crown called heavy duty. This can't be related to his private life. It had to be job related." Given what we now know about Leithman's reputation as a respected lawyer amongst Montreal's criminal underworld, why would he have been shot to death? Did he anger one of his clients enough to have them killed? And if so, why? When police arrived on scene, they were surprised to discover on Leithman's body the unlisted and private phone number of the RCMP's Claude Savoie, who was then the director of Montreal's anti-drug unit. They must have thought to themselves, why would a mob lawyer have the personal private phone number of the director of the RCMP anti-drug unit? It would have been a valid question to ask given the circumstances. One of the first tasks assigned to Leithman by Alan Ross after becoming the new leader of the West End gang was to find out what, if any, information the police were gathering from ongoing investigations, a task which crossed ethical and legal boundaries as it involved passing along confidential information obtained from corrupt officials. Leithman was apparently paid $200,000 by Ross to uncover and pass along information about any police investigations targeting either the West End gang or Alan Ross specifically. Leithman in turn contacted another one of his contacts within law enforcement, Claude Savoie, who was then the regional director of the Montreal RCMP anti-drug division. Somehow a partnership was agreed upon where Savoie would provide Leithman with information the RCMP learned via their investigations, a clear and obvious breach of Savoie's position of power. Savoie was allegedly in debt at the time and may have seen the bribe as a quick and easy way out of debt. Whatever the reasons, beginning in 1985, Savoie agreed to provide information on investigations into the West End gang's illegal activities, which Leithman passed along to Ross, and Savoie was reported to have earned up to $200,000 for his corruption. RCMP officers working in the same building as Savoie witnessed on numerous occasions meeting behind closed doors where Leithman and Savoie would speak in private for up to half an hour, a practice as unheard of now as it was back then. This arrangement lasted for a number of years, and during that time the RCMP experienced a noticeable decline in the information they gathered on West End gang, as Savoie leaked confidential information to Ross either directly or using Leithman as a conduit. Prior to Singer's death in May 1991, an associate overheard Singer's side of a phone conversation. Singer was complaining that Leithman had accused Singer of being a police informant. If true, did Leithman give the information to Alan Ross that Singer was a police informant, and was that information learned from his arrangement with Claude Savoie of the RCMP? In 1992, an internal report was drafted by the RCMP and submitted to then Solicitor General Herb Gray, which stated that Savoie leaked to Leithman the identity of an RCMP informant in May 1991. While the report doesn't name Singer or anyone else as the informant, the dates seem to match up with the death of David Singer. Evidence of the leak was so apparent that Drug Enforcement Administration agents refused to share information about their investigations of the West End gang with RCMP, as U.S. agents had strong suspicions that there was a leak in the RCMP's anti-drug office. In April 1991, $410 million worth of cocaine hidden in hammocks was shipped to the port of Montreal from Colombia, which was known to the RCMP, who were watching the shipment to see who would pick it up. However, nobody arrived to retrieve the valuable shipment of cocaine. The RCMP agents were expecting somebody to pick up this shipment almost immediately, as the longer the cocaine remained in storage, the more of a chance it had to be stolen by another gang or found by authorities. The following month, RCMP agents were alerted to another shipment of cocaine, this time with $340 million, which they again watched to see who would retrieve the shipment. But again, nobody arrived. On May 5, 1991, just a week prior to Leithman's death, he was overheard saying that he controlled a high-ranking member of the RCMP, a regional director who sold information to the West End gang, and he had been paid for his services for several years. In early May, the RCMP launched an internal investigation to uncover the leak of the anti-drug unit, and when Claude Savoie was interviewed by the investigators, Savoie said he suspected another RCMP investigator, George Late, who was also working in the anti-drug unit, of being corrupt. Following the arrest of various Cali Cartel members, RCMP agents found in their possession RCMP documents about the Cali Cartel. Around that time, Late was actually in Cartagena, Colombia on a brief meeting with members of the Cali Cartel to arrange shipments of cocaine being sent to Canada. During that meeting, that Late first recommended the maritime provinces of Canada, and specifically Labrador, as an ideal entry point for the cocaine to enter Canada. Upon the suggestion of the internal investigation team, false information was given to Late, which was later found to be in possession by members of the Cali Cartel, and Late became the RCMP's prime suspect. When the RCMP checked Late's bank accounts, he had sums that greatly exceeded a Mounties' salary. They also found circumstantial evidence that he was dating Ina Cecilia Barbosa, the Leithman client and Cali Cartel money launderer. On May 12, 1991, the day before Leithman was shot and killed, George Late called into work to say he couldn't come into work due to marital issues. In fact, he called into work every day to say he couldn't come in until May 22nd, when Late boarded a flight to Portugal, where he was born. A few days after his flight, Late's wife suddenly quit her job and flew to Portugal with $100,000 cash in a briefcase. RCMP investigators learned that Late has sold information to Barbosa close to 50 times in the span of 3 months, and he had a joint bank account which he opened with Barbosa, who proceeded to deposit $80,000 worth of bad checks. The investigators learned that Late also gave back to Barbosa her Colombian passport, which RCMP had in their possession. Former Montreal detective John Westlake believes that Late was somehow involved in the Leithman shooting, and possibly the triggerman. Westlake theorizes that Barbosa had ordered the death of Leithman, which was carried out by Late along with members of the cartel. Police detectives investigating Leithman's murder interviewed Savoy on 3 separate occasions about the meetings Savoy and Alan Ross had in Leithman's office. In the months following Leithman's death, the RCMP launched internal investigations to find out why Leithman would have Savoy's home phone number. Was Savoy the leak that was providing information to the West End gang? Although Savoy was able to shift blame to Late for a while, RCMP investigators knew there was something not right about Savoy's relationship with Leithman. The Fifth Estate, the Canada Broadcasting Corporation's hard-hitting news show, had picked up on the scent of a big story. In late fall 1992, journalist Daniel Burke met with Savoy for an on-camera interview for what Savoy thought would be a piece about his work as director of RCMP's anti-drug unit. Burke ambushed Savoy, asking questions regarding a meeting between Savoy and Alan Ross at a Montreal restaurant located under Sidney Leithman's office. A stunned Savoy quickly put 2 and 2 together, and his worst fears had come to fruition. The Fifth Estate was investigating the story that Savoy was selling confidential police information to Alan Ross, which they were planning to broadcast across the country. At this point, Savoy must have felt his web of lies was about to collapse under the immense pressure. He broke down and cried in his superior's office, who may have already known about the RCMP internal investigation, to discover the leak of the anti-drug unit, which had, over the months, began to focus on Savoy. Claude Savoy was called into work early on December 21, 1992, as he was to speak with members of RCMP internal investigations, who were tasked with investigating Savoy's possible corruption. Shortly before the meeting was to begin, Savoy's secretary heard a noise coming from his office, which she described as a desk drawer slamming shut. What she heard was a self-inflicted gunshot that ended Savoy's life. Savoy had wrapped the jacket of his police uniform around his service revolver, which muffled the sound of the gunshot. Savoy took his life the day prior to the Fifth Estate story being aired about his corruption, and journalist Hannah Gardner had to shoot a last-minute insertion into the piece announcing his suicide. She stated on camera, "Yesterday morning, Inspector Claude Savoy committed suicide in his office at RCMP headquarters in Ottawa. Savoy was 49, and he had been with the Mounties for 30 years. Late yesterday, RCMP confirmed that Savoy had been under investigation for several months." The RCMP agents tasked with investigating the leak had learned from somebody known as Informant Number 2 that Savoy was passing along to Leithman photocopied confidential C-237 forms, also known as investigative report forms. These forms provided detailed summaries of RCMP investigations and, more importantly, their future plans with regards to the investigation. Leithman then passed along the C-237 forms to Alan Ross, which he used to evade capture in Canada. While investigating the deaths of Leithman and Savoy, the RCMP investigators learned something that was truly surprising to all involved. Not only was Savoy selling RCMP secrets to Alan Ross via Leithman, but Leithman was also giving up information on his clients to Savoy. To be clear, Leithman was snitching on his gangland clients to the RCMP. Imagine what would have happened if any of the members of the Mafia, the West End Gang, the Dubois Brothers, or Colombian cartels had found out that their lawyer was selling their secrets to the police. How long would they let Leithman continue to be the holder of their secrets if he wasn't able to keep a secret? Well, we'll likely never know who exactly had Sidney Leithman killed. There were more than enough suspects who could have wanted to see him dead. The Toronto Star reporter Dale Brazil wrote, "This scandal severely tarnished Canada's national police force, shining a spotlight on the activities of the entire RCMP drug squad in Montreal during the early 1990s. If you made it this far, thanks for watching our video on the life and death of Sidney Leithman. Montreal Mobstars releases a new true crime investigation each month, so if you like this video, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and comment below with who you think killed Sidney Leithman. We hope to see you on the next episode of Montreal Mobstars.